Okay, continuing in part two here. We left off with the some of the additional setup options here that we still had to go through. And that's what we'll finish off here, and then we'll continue to go through and show some of the features of the other screens here. So auto scale to grid. When you plop a NPC, a token or POG onto a map, whether it's for player, NPC, or monster, it will automatically resize. So setting it to 80% of the grid, as long as you've got a grid enabled, will set it up so that that icon will take up only 80% of the square that they're sitting in. And that way you can see some of the features of that particular square so you know exactly where they are. So it happens to be a POG that takes up or like completely hides the background to the point where you can't see it. Having that little element around it to see, I know where they're at, makes it a little bit easier to see. Effect icon size is the next one here. And this just simply changes the size of the effect icon itself. So I tend to have it as small, and it might be a little bit hard to read, but I tend to have it as small because it puts it off into the bottom left, and it just makes it totally unobtrusive. And a little bit cleaner when you're actually going through to looking at things there. But you can set it to large or to the standard size, and it literally is just a scaling of that particular icon. Facing indicator. So when you place a character onto a map, you can actually have a little arrow that represents the direction they're facing. Although with the line of sight functionality being introduced with Unity, I'm not entirely certain if that's now required, except if they're looking at an area that is not exactly obvious. But I tend to leave it off. It can get in the way in some cases. I haven't tried it with Unity yet to see if that particular problem was resolved or not. But essentially in the previous version, it was a little yellow icon that faced or pointed in the direction the character was actually facing. And we can show that going forward in one of the examples so that you can actually at least see what it looks like. So when I drop a character onto a map, I'll try to remember to turn that function on so that you can actually see what it is. The show effects for the GM. Essentially, it will allow you to toggle whether you see all of the effects that are added without hovering over the particular NPC icon or token. I generally tend to set it at icons hover. That way, they're not in the way, and if there happens to be a creature that has a lot of effects on their icon, maybe they're blinded, they're charmed, happen to be cursed, deafened, so on and so forth. You could literally go through the gamut here. It can actually pretty much cover over the whole icon if you get everything there. Now, granted, theoretically, someone shouldn't be having all of those, but whatever. So I tend to have it as icons hover, and that way, when you hover over the NPC character or the player character as the GM, you won't see the icons until you leave the mouse there for a second. And same with the health. You can actually set it so that it's a bar hover. Again, that goes through and sets it up so that you'd have to hover over the particular NPC or player to see how damaged they are or how much health they have left. I tend to turn it off on my particular campaigns because the combat tracker shows me how much health they're suffering for that, and so I don't actually need to see that. This does the exact same thing except for the players, and players cannot, as far as I know, toggle this after the fact. So generally I set it up as icons. Health, I tend to do a bar, and I tend to show dots and icons hover on NPCs. And the reason for that is that the players are going to want to see any effects that are on another player and what the health of an ally might actually be to a certain degree. Whereas the effects can sometimes be not obvious. So it allows you to temporarily hide those effects from a particular player so that they themselves have to keep it in mind. You don't want to have Fantasy Grounds do everything for a particular player. So there might be a point where a particular NPC is in the process of burning because a fireball was launched at them and they happened to catch fire because they were prone to do so, or they're standing on lava or something to that effect. Then you don't necessarily, the player is going to have to remember that that NPC is now on fire. But at the same time, they can just simply move the mouse, hover over it, and say, "Oh yeah, that's what's there." Whereas with the enemy health, I want that to be as vague as possible when it comes to what the players see in relation to an NPC's health if they're under combat. I want them to be making guesses. Do I stick around for this particular fight? Do I take the risk and try to get out of here before I soak up too much more damage? Things like that. Excuse me. And so on and so forth. And then the show name is literally just the how the token is displayed with the map. So I tend to make it a title hover so that if a player can move their mouse over top of a particular character, and it'll show you who it is. Makes it a little easier to figure, oh, that's my icon, because if you have two characters who happen to choose the same token, it can sometimes get confusing. Now, house rules. This can sometimes make or break a particular campaign. I have had some players have issues with, for instance, the fumble and critical rolls. I have also had players not necessarily care about how those operate or function, but it can get to a point where you, as the DM, literally state, we're using critical fumbles, or we're using this, or we're using that. That's essentially what comes into play here. I tend to use the crit and fumble table, and if you do enable that, by the way, this is the alternate way to get to the modules screen. So there's a default crit and fumble table. You have to have this loaded in order for this to actually function. And essentially what that is that if a character happens to roll a die 20 and they get 20, so they've made a critical roll, there's a chance that an additional effect could come into play. So there's a very good chance it's just literally double damage. Or you could have a role-playing effect kick out. You have totally disabled that particular character's armor. You cut the strap off that armor, and it's now suffering -4 to its overall armor class because its armor is no longer protecting it. Those kinds of things can actually happen, and it provides a level of randomness when it comes to a critical hit. The same applies to a critical fumble, and generally you can either just do a straight miss through a critical fumble, or I tend to like it set up so that there's also a bit of randomness on the opposite side. So again, it provides a bit of risk or a bit of benefit to the player, depending on how they roll. Auto deaths on. So, all right, auto death rolls. So when a player is knocked out because they have gone underneath their below 0 on their hit points, when their turn comes up in the next round, you can either have the player make their death saving roll or have Fantasy Grounds do it for you. This is a setting I actually let the players make the decision on because it's going to affect them directly. In my last campaign, I had that automatically turned on, whereas in a test campaign that I had run for a brief stint, I had that turned off because the players wanted it turned off. But literally, it just comes down to whether a particular player automatically rolls their death saving throws or not upon their turn. Mpc Hit Points. So Mpc Hit Points determines the number of Mpc hit points that a particular NPC is going to have when they're actually added to the combat tracker. The standard, just confirming here, the standard will give an average particular hit points, whereas max will make sure that they have the maximum possible hit points available. And I believe there is... Did they get rid of random? Sorry, correction. The standard will actually go through... there it is. I knew there was a random. Whereas the random will actually allow things to determine. So if a particular NPC has 2d6 hit points, or 2d6 hit die of hit points, instead of the standard would be the average, meaning that the NPC has 7 hit points. If it was max, that NPC would have 12 hit points. And if it's a random, it could have anything from 2 to 12 hit points. And that's what I tend to play with, because again, it introduces another amount of risk to the players, because they could either run up to a party of goblins that are very easy to kill, or they might have one goblin that, holy crap, he's got max hit points and he's soaking up damage left, right, and center. He might be their tank, for instance. So you can role play that out. It gives you that, oh, this guy's going to be tougher, so I can role play that a little bit differently than these guys, for example, as the DM. And again, it adds to the overall story, which is the whole purpose of being a DM. Roll initiative on each round. That comes down to whether you as the DM prefer to have the initiative re-rolled every single time the round finishes and it starts a new round, or not. That is a complete decision between you and your players. I've run with both scenarios, and right now I tend to leave it on, but I leave it on because it takes me back to the old pen and paper days where it was literally a roll every single time a round completed. If you have an initiative being rolled at the end of each turn, you might have a party that's doing completely horribly. And they might finally get that one roll where they're going first. They get their hits in, and it takes out the NPC that they've been combating. I can tell you that I find that a little bit more enjoyable, and I've had some players tell me that it's a little bit more enjoyable because it adds an additional level of randomness to an overall encounter. So you could actually have it where a player who finished last in the previous round now is going first in the first round. So they get to continue a scenario they may have been trying to plan out or play out. And it provides a level of enjoyment that I think the players seem to follow through with quite well. When it comes to massive system shock, if you as a player take a significant amount of damage, I believe it is equal to more than half of your damage, you will automatically roll a Constitution save. If you fail, you will pass out, because you've literally just taken so much damage that you cannot stay awake any further. I've had situations where I've had it on. I've had situations where I have it off. I think it really comes down to a point of negotiation with your players in this particular situation, because it can really introduce a lot of risk to a particular campaign. If all of a sudden your party's tank has taken so much damage in one blow that they're now rendered unconscious, the rest of that party might end up just simply wiping, and you might only have a very short game. So it comes down to a risk. Now, if you're running a hard campaign, that's probably a setting you're going to want to turn on. It really comes down to what level of risk you want to be able to put your players through. Diagonal distance. When you are on the map, all the squares are typically 5 feet north-south, 5 feet east-west. That's the area that they represent, or not the area, but that's the spacing that they represent. Diagonally, you can adjust that, because technically, mathematically, it is longer of a distance. I think it works out to be like 7 feet, not 5 feet, but maybe 7.5. My math is not great these days, but I tend to leave it at 5, and in a lot of cases, even when you're doing a pen and paper in-person session, everyone usually sets those as 5. So moving diagonally at 5 is generally easier to calculate on how much movement you as a player have, or whether your character can actually reach a particular mob, things like that if you only have a 5-foot reach. And there are other settings. I believe it's variant or standard are the two settings. So variant just sort of adjusts the overall length of that particular square to be slightly longer. Encumbrance is essentially how encumbered a particular character is. So there'll be movement penalties that come into play if they are encumbered. There could be exhaustion penalties that come into play if they are encumbered, depending on the rule sets, things like that. So I tend to turn that on because I do track weight. I do have my characters track weight. The party inventory is there for a reason. I let the party stuff all the stuff they don't want to carry on the person into that party inventory, and they typically will ride around with a wagon or a horse and wagon, or donkey and wagon, depending on what they lucked into for a particular campaign. But it runs the risk that if that donkey ever gets killed, they have to leave that wagon behind. They lose all the stuff that's in that party inventory, that kind of thing. So the encumbrance comes into play in that it allows you to enforce a certain weight limit. That way you don't have a whole bunch of pack rats all over the place. Now, healing variants are essentially allows you to give the player a bit of a surge, if you will, during overall healing. So, for instance, there's a standard balance, there's healing surges, or slow natural healing. So during a long rest, you won't recover all 100% of your hit points that your party has lost during a particular long rest, and which makes sense to be honest. If you're sleeping overnight, the leg you just had completely slashed up the day before isn't necessarily going to be fully healed. You're still going to suffer some level of damage there. Again, that comes down to a party negotiation. Healing surges allows you to heal a little bit faster, and also allows you to recover some of your hit dice a little bit better. But again, it comes down to what you want to play as a DM. So I think it's Dungeon Master's Guide 266 to 267 or something along those lines. If you want to read the rules in greater detail, or just find them online. And inspiration slots. Inspiration gives players an advantage. And if you watch the previous video where I was describing a player's character sheet, in the upper right part of the main section of that character sheet near the token is the inspiration button. You can have up to 3 inspiration points as the max in the game. I've used things where I've literally had 1 inspiration point. I've also set it up where my current campaign is actually set up now to use 3 inspiration points. And essentially what I've done, I've made the decision that during a saving throw or an ability check, if a character rolls a 20, they gain an inspiration point. If they roll a 1, they lose an inspiration point. And it forces the player to use them. Whereas when I had it set to 1 inspiration point, they just let it sit there and they never actually used it. Now that, because there was never a risk that they would actually lose it. Now they will in respect to this particular process. And the reason I did that is it counterbalanced the critical hit and critical fail. Because I wasn't using an experience point based leveling system anymore, is now switching to milestone leveling. And I needed something that would counterbalance out the sudden loss of, if they rolled a 20, they got 100 experience points, because that was something that I had actually set up and rewarded. So it made sense in this particular campaign that I'm running through. There are other situations and scenarios that you can actually go through and use those particular inspiration points for. But generally what it is it gives a player the ability to roll with advantage on certain things. But you can still award them manually as well. So if you got a player that's gone through and has role played a particular situation really well, then you can actually provide them an inspiration point and reward them for that particular role play, and it encourages that as a result. The last two options here are in the languages. So you can actually map the individual languages to the font that is being provided in the game. So you can actually download some additional fonts. That's the reason why the options are here. And common is not mapped to anything except itself, and deep speech, I'm not sure why that's not mapped to something else. I think it also is kind of similar to common, but so there's a lot of little things here that you can actually go through and set up. And essentially all it does is it modifies how that particular language is presented in the chat window. It does nothing else. It doesn't change what language your game is set or anything like that. And currencies, it allows you to override like you can fully spell out platinum pieces or gold pieces or electrum pieces, so on and so forth, or you can change it to something completely different. There are different rule sets that use different currencies when it comes to the in-game coinage. Excuse me. So those are really the options that allow you to toggle how the interface is going to function. So what I'm going to do next is show you some of the new things that have now popped up because we now have modules loaded. So if you remember, if you happen to watch the previous episode, or sorry, 2 videos ago, then you would have seen me create an empty character that is presented there. And that particular NPC is owned by this player. And in relation to that, all the information that they will put in here, which I will do in, I think, the next episode, will be added in here, and you can go through, you can see it, stuff like that. And there's nothing specific here that is set up for the DM only. It is every tab that is here, a player can see. It's their character sheet, and they have the ability to export it. This button here. So you click the character sheet and or import it rather. There is a way to export it, but it's not necessarily obvious as to how you can actually go through and do that now. It doesn't look like you can actually export directly from here. You can take ownership. So if all of a sudden this player connects and there happens to be 2 E's here as opposed to the 1, and that will mean that they won't be able to find this particular character because that's how it maps it to that particular character. So you can actually remove the ownership by clicking that button, and then when they open up this character tab, they'll see it, and then they can claim ownership. You can clear the owner. Sorry, clear the owner is what that one's for. You can take ownership as the DM. That way you can, if a player has died and they're no longer playing, you as the DM can prevent it from being shown in the rest of the party list. But if you have a player that was playing and they've been forced to take a break, you can take ownership, and then when they return, you just simply return it to them. So you'd go take ownership, then clear owner. Create item means you can create another NPC here, or player here. And typically you'll do that if you're going to set up an NPC that is actually more of a player. And that's what I will usually do. So when I run through my games, I will have a player interface open in addition to my DM interfaces. A, so that I can see what it is that the players are actually seeing. And B, so that I can inject NPC players with proper character sheets at specific times throughout the campaigns if they happen to need them. And it just makes things a little bit easier. And then the last item is delete, and then close. So that is something that will be different there. Notes function exactly the same way as players, except when you create a note, it is private to you, unless you intentionally share it. And as a DM, I have literally tens of notes in this particular field to keep track of certain things. Images and maps. So this is going to be something that is now populated with some information. So things like images specific to NPCs. You will see a series of drop downs here that will go through and show specific information, as well as the ability to open up maps. And display that for use in a campaign. There are also images for items. So a backpack, that's what a backpack looks like, things like that. And all of these were added to this based on the book that you see here. So they've actually, it looks like they've broken things out a little bit differently. Interesting. I didn't think that was enough, but anyway. And that's what this is for. So it allows you to load up the maps that you need. It also allows you to load up a particular picture. So to share a picture, you would actually just right-click on it and share it with the player base. And what that will do is it will pop that up on their screen so that you can introduce an encounter with. You see 4 of these creatures staring back at you. Okay. And typically you would have it set up so that, or at least on the previous version, you could set it up so that they couldn't see what this particular name represented, what this title was. I don't know if they're going to do that with this particular version of Fantasy Grounds or not. But it allowed a level of mystery that you could present to them what it was without showing them the name, so they just couldn't simply go look it up on the internet to determine how to best defeat it. That kind of thing. And you do the same thing with maps. So when you're presenting a particular map to players for running through, so let's just temporarily load up this map. You go right-click share. That will now pop up on their screen, and then you drop their characters onto it from the combat tracker. And we'll get to that once we get to a particular combat situation. Okay, tables. These are now your random tables. So there are different backgrounds that are going to be here. There will be treasure rolls that you can do, and you can see here that there are a large number of pages. There's random dungeons that you can do, and I went through one of these, and it's actually quite interesting on how to do that. But all of the tables that you would typically manually roll from the Dungeon Master's Guide, Player's Handbook, or any of the supplemental guides, they're all in here. And it will allow you to go in and generate those tables. So here, for example, is the critical hit initial roll, and if it goes into an effect, these are the effects that you could actually go through and potentially have an NPC suffer from or benefit from, things like that. So these are highly useful for if and when you're setting up like a random treasure, for example. You could set up 5,000 gold pieces worth of gemstones, or set it up for magic item table rolls, stuff like that. The storyline is where you're going to drive the story. So everything here is a chapter in the overall story, and you can see there's 2 pages of it here. And you will typically start with not necessarily with the contents, but you'll typically start with chapter 1. Or this here will be the initial summary. This gives you your credits and stuff like that. And I should probably load the credits for this particular module to give them credit for that. Great module, guys, by the way. Thank you. And so on and so forth. But to get to the point where you're actually starting the particular module, you can see that everything's clickable here. So here's where your adventure begins. So it provides the starting point, but not necessarily the hook. And typically what you will find with these modules is that you will find an adventure hook section. And you just click that open, and it will go through and allow you to create that hook that gets the players to go from where you think they're starting to where you want them to be. And you don't necessarily have to use that particular adventure hook, but usually the module will provide you a few examples to get there. And then there's templates. So you can actually go through and build your own story. And we'll get into the templates more when we go through that particular process. Okay. Okay, so there's that and that. Quests are all the individual quests and what the details of that particular quest, as well as the experience points and the challenge rating for it, are going to be. And essentially, this is just a summary of all of the quests that are in this particular module that are tagged as a particular quest. Some might just be encounters, which you will find under the encounter section. That was another icon that was new that I forgot to mention. NPCs. Here you will now find all of the NPCs that are provided by the Dungeon Master's Guide. by the module that you yourself are running. So you theoretically could run this entire module without actually having the Monsters Manual, for example, or without having the Dungeon Master's Guide, for example. All of the items and elements are included with it. Now, there are some things that I think are a bit buggy as a result of that, and I might showcase one of them during the playthrough if we get that far. So there's a particular axe that you can get as a loot item that isn't fully defined when it comes to Mines of Phandelver. You have to go through and manually fill it in for some of the information. So I'm hoping that got fixed at some point in the past before Unity got released, but I actually never went back to check. And any NPC that you could potentially run into is going to be in any of the modules that you load. And when you're doing a combat encounter, then typically it's beneficial to have this up on the side so that you know exactly what kind of combats are. Well, actually, this is a particular trap. So let's say green slime here, for example. They have some very specific actions, and just moving your mouse over the areas will show you exactly what it is that they can do. Encounters. This is great for all of the encounters that you're going to do. You won't be rolling random encounters here. What would go in here would be the result of some encounters that are already there, or some pre-generated encounters that are already here. So if you happen to go through and set up a particular table roll for a wilderness roll, and it'll pop up, oh, there's an X number of ghouls, and it might pop up this particular wild encounter. If you use these tables, though, and nope, there are some tables here. Just one sec. My apologies. They actually have set it up over here. So you click on random, and it will give you all of the options associated with random encounters. So if your party's going through a particular forest, then you can go through and potentially roll a generation on this particular campaign or encounter, or select one of these. So random ghouls, you can have up to 1d4 plus 1 particular ghouls, things like that. Although I don't know why everyone starts with identified. I might have to look into that. Okay, what else is there? Then there are the items. So these are all of the items that the player's handbook loads, the Dungeon Master's Guide loads for magic items, and as you can see, it takes a few minutes to go through and do the initial load, as well as what the Mines of Phandelver's module and any other supplemental will load. And as you can see, there's 18 pages worth of items. And you can't, this is another window that you can stretch out, but it literally lists everything. So once again, is the option up here to filter, as well as search and by any of these particular toggles. So you can search for an item that matches a name that happens to have an attunement required, for example, or is a legendary or common level. So it'll try to bucket the equipment into those particular categories, and show you the results here. And come on, go away. Additionally, you can actually generate random items up here. So give it a second. I actually haven't tried this with Unity version, so I don't know if that's, yep, there we go. So you can actually generate this is a full list of all of the armor that is here, and it allows you to go through and sort through that. But you can also make your own through these templates. And once again, it takes a moment. I'm pretty certain this brings up a series of random roll tables. Minimize that. So these are all of the items that you can use as a particular template to populate the forge. So you can drag a bead of force onto here and combine that with I don't know, a basket, and then forge a magic item. And it will go through, and if they happen to match the same type, it will go through and create an item for you. So you can see it's actually trying to do something. And it turns it into a basket of force, although that would be kind of strange. Now, I'm going to have to go look for that. So one thing that this item here has been generated by me, which means it hasn't been assigned a particular bucket. And anything that is generated by you will always fall under the new category by default. So let's just close those two things. And I'm going to delete that item because I don't need it. So that's the items. Now, parcels. This is all of the rewards that are associated with a particular module. And as you go through the story, you will find a link to these from the appropriate element of the story or section of the map that pops up an element of the story associated with that particular module. And it will show you exactly what they will be getting during a particular loot. So this one is not getting any currency at all, but is found a historical tome. Whereas this one here, there's some gold and some cottages, and silver and copper, stuff like that. And then there's the assets page, and this is literally going to be a complete list of all of the tokens that you have loaded, all of the portraits that are available, a complete summary of all of the images that are available, or everything all in one. And if you pop this, it will open up the folder that all of this information is stored in. So let's say you want to find an elvish token. You can type in elf, and it will show you all of the available tokens. So these are the pogs that I was referring to, and this would be considered a top-down token. And it will literally look for anything that has the word elf in the name of the particular file. And then you can just literally drag and drop that onto a character sheet. And it will apply that particular token to that particular character. Same with portraits. If you had an Arokura character, I have no idea how to pronounce that, then you can drag and drop this onto their portrait. But in some cases, you might have a particular character that has that particular portrait. And then these are other images that are available, so you can actually load up all the maps from here. So it allows you to manage the maps and whatnot a little bit differently. And that is where this one is going to, this video is going to stop for now. We're already at approximately 25 minutes into this, and on top of the 40 plus, or almost hour that was in the previous video. So I'm going to stop this here, and then I'm going to set up the next video series to be, this is how to be a character creation series. And I'm going to go through and create a party for this particular campaign. And then I don't know yet how I'm going to display the Dungeon Master side as well as the player side on the screen yet. I haven't quite figured that out. And I know how to do it in the software I'm using to record this stuff, but I don't know if YouTube will allow me to present that that kind of a video in this particular series. But I think it's worthwhile seeing what the DM is going to see versus what the player sees, so that the DMs can gain an insight into what the players are going to see while they're running through an adventure. At the same time, the players can see what the DM has to deal with in relation to going through and managing that particular campaign, and so on and so forth. So generally, you typically don't run a one-person campaign, but for the purposes of this tutorial, I'll go through and do that to show everybody what's going to happen. But I still have some additional work before I even get to that point. So once I've got the characters created, then we can start doing a detail of the chat window in great detail, how this function works, how the dice work. And then start working on the individual aspects of the combat tracker, the party sheet, things like that. Oh, right, the party sheet. There is one thing I forgot to show here. So if you watch the player-specific video, then you'll notice that there are two different tabs that weren't there. So main is where the PCs related to the party will be dropped, and you'll see that in greater detail once we actually get a party created and dropped into here. But at the same time, it allows you to do a series of rolls or skill ability checks and skill checks against the whole party, and you can hide or show those results. So we'll toggle that as well. Finally, if you're going to be awarding experience points, then instead of doing a milestone structure, then when a character or when the party has completed a particular quest, you can literally drag and drop that storyline into, or that quest line into here, and it will calculate the amount of experience points that will be rewarded across the party. And the same with encounter. If a party successfully defeats an encounter through combat or through negotiation, then you can drop an associate reward into there. Now, I typically also, when I was doing experience points, I created a quest item to how well the parties role played for that particular session, and I would just toggle and untoggle it when I felt that they did something that was warranting some additional experience points. And you can also just take that and drop it right on top of a character, just to maybe one character out of the whole party role played really well. But that is literally all of the screens that are available initially, with the exception of the calendar. And I'll go into the calendar in another video because that's a video on its own. And that is a summary of what the interface looks like for Fantasy Grounds. So next, I will go through and show you how character creation works for 5th edition. And then once that is done, I will go through and start explaining a lot more in the way of chat functionality and stuff like that. I think at this point, really, chat and setting up these tabs are really the two things that I haven't fully covered in relation to the basics and how to operate with this. But the easiest way to show this, how this works, is in a combat situation. So I may wait until we get to that particular situation. Okay, so I will stop it here, and then we'll pick it up in the next video.